What happens when a quiet janitor gets fired for helping a lost girl at the mall? Carl thought it was over until a black SUV pulled up to his house days later. What happened next changed his life and stunned the entire nation. Carl Bennett had never been the kind of man who made noise. 60 years old, Army vet, worked the past 11 years as a janitor at Maplewood Plaza, a sprawling, corporate-owned mall tucked into the tired edges of suburban Minneapolis. He wasn't flashy, he didn't complain, didn't call out sick, just showed up every morning in a neatly pressed but faded uniform and did the job nobody notices unless it's not done. He cleaned gum off the underside of food court tables, picked up French fries teenagers used as ammo, wiped soda off baby stroller wheels without so much as a grumble. Not because he loved it, because someone had to, and he believed in doing things right. But that Tuesday, that day pulled the rug out from under the quiet little rhythm he'd built for himself. He was working his usual afternoon shift near the food court, mop in hand, when he spotted her. A girl, maybe 16, sitting on the cold tile floor by the arcade machines, arms wrapped around her knees, silent tears running down her cheeks. No one else even looked. A couple walked by pretending not to notice. A mall security guard glanced her way, then kept walking, probably figured it was someone else's problem. One guy in a suit scoffed under his breath, probably TikTok drama, and rolled his eyes. But Carl, he stopped. He walked over, crouched down, and spoke gently, like she was a cornered animal. "You all right, sweetheart?" She flinched at first, then shook her head. Her name was Claire. Her wallet was stolen, phone was dead, and her parents, according to her, were in another state on business. She'd been stranded in the mall for hours, no way to get home, no one to call. Carl didn't waste time. He led her, slowly, carefully, to the small security office behind the food court, staff-only area. Not exactly protocol, but she needed warmth, a chair, and a goddamn phone charger, not another cold shoulder. Carl gave her his own phone cord, bought her lunch from Panda Express, with what little he had in his wallet, and sat with her. Talked her down from that shaky, teary panic, the way only someone who's seen real trauma knows how. 2 hours later, security finally got through to an aunt in Wisconsin. The girl was safe. Before she left, Claire hugged Carl like he was family. "Thank you, Mr. Bennett," she said. Soft, honest. Carl didn't think much of it, just walked home that night the way he always did, slow, stiff from arthritis, but a little lighter, knowing he'd made someone's world better, if only for a moment. The next morning, he got a call to report to the office. Inside, behind a desk big enough to land a plane on, sat mall operations manager Gregory Larson, mid-30s, Ivy League haircut, the kind of guy who thinks a wrinkle in his suit is a national emergency. Larson didn't even look up when Carl entered, just held up a printed photo from the security feed. "You were seen bringing a minor into a staff-only area yesterday," he said flatly. "That's a direct breach of mall protocol." Carl stared for a moment, unsure if it was real. She was crying on the floor. Her wallet was gone. Her phone was dead. "I wasn't going to just walk past her like everyone else." Larson sighed, like he'd just been mildly inconvenienced by a slow internet connection. "Your intentions are not the issue. Procedures exist for a reason. You endangered yourself and the mall's liability. We're letting you go, effective immediately." And just like that, it was done. No second chances. No, "Thank you for 11 years. No handshake, just Carl, now jobless, standing in the same uniform he'd worn through snowstorms and food court fires, staring at a door that was no longer his to walk through. He didn't speak, didn't argue, just nodded once, left the building, and stepped into the cold like a man who'd been pushed off the edge for doing the one thing no one else had the courage to do: care. That night, he sat in his small apartment, beige walls, old recliner, military plaques collecting dust, wondering how it had all come to this. Fired for helping a kid. And as if the punch wasn't enough, there was no severance, no health coverage, no appeal. Just a cardboard box of his belongings and a sinking sense that the world didn't want men like him anymore. The ones who still believed in right and wrong. But fate wasn't done with Carl Bennett. Carl Bennett sat in his worn recliner, the one with the fabric rubbed thin on the armrest from years of habit. and stared out the window into a silent Minnesota evening. Outside, the sky had that dull, winter-gray tint that made time feel slower. Snow was coming. He could feel it in his knees before the forecast ever said it. Inside, the apartment was quiet. Too quiet. No hum of the mall's floor buffer, no shuffle of tired feet across linoleum, just him, and the question that wouldn't stop circling in his mind like a moth to a porch light. Was I wrong? He'd spent decades doing things the right way, the hard way, raised his voice only when absolutely necessary, showed up early, stayed late, never asked for favors, never expected applause, and yet here he was, unemployed, alone, and tossed out like a day-old receipt. For helping a kid. Not stealing, not slacking, just helping. And the worst part? Nobody even asked. No one pulled him aside to say, "Hey Carl, what really happened?" No one looked at the situation and saw a scared girl and a man trying to do what decent people are supposed to do. They just fired him. Cold, clinical, efficient, like wiping away a coffee stain and pretending it was never there. He sat there for hours, the daylight fading around him, until the room fell into that kind of dim half-dark that made shadows feel heavier. His old military plaques still hung on the wall, a few black and white photos from his service days, a folded flag in a wooden case, symbols of a life spent standing up for something. Now, they just stared back at him like relics from another man's story. He rubbed his face with calloused hands and whispered into the stillness, "Maybe I should have just walked by." That thought hit harder than he expected, because deep down, Carl knew. Once you start ignoring people in pain, you don't stop. It becomes a habit, and eventually, you forget how to care altogether. That night, he dreamt. A long corridor stretched ahead of him, the mall but distorted. Fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered overhead, dying out one by one as he walked forward. His footsteps echoed, but he was alone. No Claire, no shoppers. No noise, just silence, and the slow, eerie feeling of being erased. He woke up with a jolt, the dream clinging to him like cold sweat. The apartment was still dark, no calls, no messages. The world, it seemed, had already moved on. He shuffled to the kitchen, brewed the cheapest coffee he had, and leaned against the counter, his hands wrapped around the chipped mug, trying to find warmth in something. Anything. And yet, as the sun finally began to rise over the quiet street outside, something shifted inside him. He didn't know it yet, couldn't have, but the world hadn't forgotten him. Not everyone had walked by. What came next would shake everything he thought he knew. This was only the beginning. On the third day after his firing, Carl Bennett sat on his porch like he had every morning since. Same chair, same chipped mug, same silence. The sting hadn't dulled. He'd been let go for helping a scared kid. No investigation, no questions, no humanity, just a policy violation and a handshake that never came. It was the kind of thing that made a man question the whole system and himself. Then, around 10 a.m., a black SUV pulled up in front of his house. Not the kind of car neighbors drive. This one hummed low and stopped with purpose. Two men in suits stepped out, professional, composed, federal. Carl stood up slowly, heart already pounding. "Mr. Bennett," one of them asked, "we're with the U.S. Secret Service." Carl's eyes narrowed. "What's this about?" "We'd like to talk to you," the second man said, "about the girl at the mall." Carl's chest tightened. "I didn't do anything to her. The agent cut in, calm and clear. "We know. That's why we're here." Turns out, Claire, the girl Carl helped, was the daughter of the deputy director of the FBI. She had run away after a fight, turned off her phone and vanished for hours. Her family understandably panicked, but it was Carl who saw her, Carl who stopped, Carl who helped when no one else even looked. And when Claire told her father what happened, about the janitor who sat beside her, fed her, listened without judgment, everything changed. The deputy director ordered a full review, not of Carl, of the people who fired him. Later that day, Carl got a call from the mayor's office. A formal apology, a public correction. Larson, the manager who fired him, had been dismissed. Carl was offered his job back, but that wasn't the part that stayed with him. No, what stayed was what came next. A second call, this time from Washington, an invitation to speak at a federal leadership program, to teach professionals how to recognize compassion in action and how to never punish it again. Carl hung up the phone, walked back to his porch, and sat down. For the first time in days, he exhaled. He hadn't been forgotten. He'd been seen. And that made all the difference. 1 week later, Carl Bennett opened his mailbox and saw something that didn't belong. A thick white envelope, gold seal, no return address, not a bill, not junk mail, something official. Inside was a letter, not printed, but typed on heavyweight paper, with a real signature at the bottom. The first line stopped him cold. You are one of those rare individuals who make the world safer for our children, not with titles, but with heart. The signature, the President of the United States. Carl stood in his living room for a full minute, staring at the letter, rereading it twice to be sure it was real. It was. The invitation was clear. They wanted him to serve as a national safety advisor, focusing on compassion-first crisis response in schools and public spaces. But Carl had one condition. He didn't want a plaque. He didn't want a desk with his name in gold letters. What he wanted, what he insisted on, was this. Let me train the next generation. Let me teach them what no policy manual can. Never walk past another person's pain. And so they did. 1 month later, Carl stood in a packed city council chamber. He wore a clean gray blazer, borrowed, and a small American flag pin on his collar. But the room wasn't focused on his clothes. They were focused on him. He was being awarded the Medal for Civil Courage, the highest honor the state could give a civilian. It wasn't for how long he worked. It wasn't for his military service. It was for the moment he stopped. For the choice he made when no one else did. In the front row sat Claire, hair brushed, shoulders back, eyes bright, smiling, alive, present. Not a scared girl on a cold floor anymore. When Carl was handed the microphone, he didn't read from notes. He didn't need them. He looked around the room, took a breath, and said, I didn't know who she was, didn't care whose daughter she might be. I just saw a child who needed help, and I did what any decent person ought to do. I stopped. Then a pause. The kind of pause that fills a room, holds it in suspension. And then the audience rose. Applause thundered through the hall, not polite, not routine, but real. Long, loud, and unstoppable. It wasn't for a janitor. It wasn't for a headline. It was for a man who reminded everyone what it means to care when no one's looking.